And you can just go ahead and get started. Okay. All right. Well, thank you all so much for coming. Thank you. And thank you for those of you who are joining online and are joining even on demand later. Thank you so much for your interest. My name is Ellen Thackeray. I am the preservation planner here at the city. So I help to administer the historic district. That's one of my jobs. I'm here today with Timothy Boscarino and Michael Webb with Vinewood Preservation Planning, and I'm going to let them introduce themselves in just a moment. Katie Kolakithis may be joining us as well from the State Historic Preservation Office. Before we get too far though, Tom, would you be able to watch the chat and for the folks at home to tell me if they can hear okay? Okay, great. Hello. Thank you so much. Okay, so we're going to just go ahead and get started. Before we do, I want to just let you all know that we are really grateful to both the State Historic Preservation Office and the National Park Service. This project that we are going to talk about, the Resurvey project in the Historic District, was funded but with a grant from the National Park Service. Ypsilanti has gotten a designation as what's called a certified local government through the National Park Service. There are about 80 of those throughout the state of Michigan. And one of the benefits of being a certified local government is that you can apply for these grants. To get certified, you just have to have your historic district in place. You have to have your ordinance and your plan in your historic district commission, and you have to be actively planning your preservation of your historic resources. And so Ypsilanti is a certified local government. And so that is how we got our certified local government grant to fund this survey project. So we're really grateful to the National Park Service and the State Historic Preservation Office. And thanks again to all of you for your interest in attending. Did it work? There we go. Okay, so before I jump in here, I'm going to let Tim and Michael introduce themselves, and then I will do the first few slides, and then they're going to take over. And I should say, if you could save your questions till the end, that would be great. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Tim with Vinewood Preservation Planning. I'm a historian and the project manager. And so how's everybody doing today? Great.
And I'm Michael. I'm also a historian with Vinewood Preservation Planning. I'm going to be doing a lot of the writing, but also a lot of the field work and taking pictures on this project.
So I just wanted to just give us just a really brief overview of our historic district here in Ypsilanti. We are really lucky that we had some early, and some of those folks are here in the room, but we had some early preservationists who really actively fought to keep some of our historic the historic resources that we have. They didn't just magically get saved. People had to actively save them. So we owe those folks a big debt of gratitude. So here in Michigan, Michigan passed its State Enabling Act so that we could have local historic districts in 1970. And then as early as 1972, this group was active in trying to save Ypsilanti's historic places. They did the work, they did the survey, just like we're going to embark on again. They photographed the resources, they researched, they did all the work, put it together in what we call a study committee report. And that report is what we use to this day, back from 1972. Those folks put that document together, created a map. City Council accepted that map, but it wasn't until 1978 that we got our district that we have now. So we got our ordinance passed, and that is where the protections came from. So as you travel from place to place in Michigan and across the country, you will see that there are not a lot of communities quite as intact as we have. We have a lot of our historic resources still. We have our commercial district in Depot Town. We have all of our, a lot of our historic neighborhoods. We still have this commercial strip and along Michigan. So we are really, really lucky that we have as much as we have. Our historic district is about 820 properties. And the map, I don't know if the folks at home can see it, but the map, it's roughly between Hamilton and Prospect, and then Forest down to Michigan. And then there's a couple more blocks south of Michigan that make up our district as well. So it's a little bit of an irregular shape, but that's how we got our district. And I'm so grateful to those folks for working so hard to save what we have. The documentation that they provided is great. We all use it. We use it all the time. But there are a couple reasons that we need to resurvey, and we'll get into those next. Besides that, we have so many beautiful historic buildings to look at. Some of the benefits of having your historic district, the historic district is a local historic district is really the only way to manage demolition in your city. So when you survey and you identify the buildings that are your most historic and you create that district, you're managing the change that happens in your most historic places in your city. And that is a huge benefit because people will come to places where there is a there, right? People want to be where it feels authentic and there's history that you can touch and see. And so that's a huge benefit, is that we have that for our visitors, but also for our residents and our quality of life and our property owners, and to have thriving commercial districts. So for all those reasons, I think our historic district does all that for us. It's been really, really beneficial to us. The other thing is we know that within the historic districts, our property values are stabilized and improved as compared to outside of it. So it does a lot of good, but also I want all of you to know that if you have a contributing building in the local historic district, any work that you do may be eligible for the state historic tax credit. And we can certainly talk more about that. If you look at the Historic District webpage, there is a link to the State Historic Tax Credit Program. There is also a webinar there that we have recorded, and we've posted it to YouTube. The link is on our Historic District webpage. So if you're doing work on your historic house and if it contributes to the historic district, and Tim and Michael will talk a little bit more about what it means to be a contributing building. And I can always check for you. If you want to call me and ask me, does my building contribute? I'm always happy to check the documentation that we have. That's one of the things that we do. So know that there is a state tax credit out there for you. That is another benefit that we have. So I just wanted to give you sort of just a brief history and just some benefits. There are more benefits than what I mentioned, but I wanted to make sure we all appreciate what we have, and it's unique. It's not everywhere that we have so many resources that are preserved. So I just want to talk briefly about what is a survey and why do we survey to begin with. A survey is really a compilation of photographs. So it's like a snapshot in time. When you put your survey report together, there are some summaries. There's some identification of some threats and some challenges to preservation. But there's the photographs. There's the photographs of every resource in your district. And that just provides a snapshot. From this point, this is what these buildings looked like. And that's really valuable for researchers from now until for the next 40 years. Having that snapshot in time is really valuable. But besides that, it's also, it compiles a lot of historic information so that we can better understand the historic significance of this place and the stories that this place has to tell. So the survey helps gather all that information. It gathers the snapshot in time, and it gathers all the historic information that we can find and put together. And it helps us understand why this place is so important. Why are we resurveying? So the historic information that we have right now was gathered as early as 1972. We have some photographs from the early 80s, like 81, 82. There was also some nominations written for the National Register and the State Historic Register. So we have all these pieces from the 70s and early 80s, and we use them. We still use them today. But there are some parts of the survey report that don't include, for example, like that list of contributing and non-contributing buildings that I mentioned. As we make decisions about our historic places, and as people come and they say, we need to do work on our building, we look and see, okay, is this building contributing, and how intact is it? And having that understanding is important as we manage the change that happens in the district going forward. And so that's just one example of something that's missing from our current documentation from the late, early to late 70s and early 80s. We don't have that list of contributing and non-contributing buildings. Not every building was surveyed at the time. So a lot of them were, but we do have some gaps. And also buildings change over time, and new buildings are built, and buildings gain significance sometimes as they age. So back in the early 80s, when a building was being looked at, someone thought, well, this building from the 60s doesn't seem significant. It's just a modern building. But as time passes, we gain a new appreciation and a new understanding of those buildings. And so as we do that, and as we think about different historic lenses, we're now thinking about stories that we weren't maybe telling back then. We weren't maybe thinking about the different lenses we should look at our history and think about inclusive history. So for those reasons, there are just some gaps in the documentation that we do have that make it a great idea to resurvey. I think it's really important to understand, though, that the resurvey is step one of our process of updating our documentation and doing work. So the resurvey itself is not going to change anything. It's not going to change boundaries. It's not going to make it so we don't have a historic district anymore. It's really just to get that snapshot in time and gain a new understanding, a more complete understanding of our historic places. And then from there, from that data, then we can take that forward and as a city, use it from our planning going forward. One thing that we do know we want to do is we do want to take once the survey project is done, it'll be done in August of 2025. We want to take that information and we do want to update the existing study committee report that we have to get that non-contributing, contributing list in there, to get that more complete understanding. So this is step one. We will then update our study committee report that helps guide all the work in the district. And then we'll also integrate it into our other planning around the city. I think that's the main thing I wanted to say about that. And I'm going to turn it over to these guys. Thanks so much.
Great. Thank you. And thanks a lot, Ellen, for inviting us to participate and work on this project. We've already begun the research phase and we're going to be in the field work phase soon. And again, I'm Tim, my colleague Michael. We're going to be the ones actually doing this work. So I'm just going to go into the details of what our scope of work and what our timeline looks like. So as Ellen mentioned, there's a variety of objectives that we're looking to accomplish when we're doing this survey work. But if I had to pick, if you asked me, what is the number one most essential outcome or overall goal we're trying to accomplish? I would say it's developing that list of what we call contributing and non-contributing resources. And I'll explain what that means. So what does contributing mean? It's kind of a technical term. When we say contributing, we really just mean historic. So we really just mean we're developing an understanding of what are the historic buildings and what are the non-historic buildings. And again, we try not to say buildings, we try to say resources, because it's not always just a building. We look at bridges, monuments, statues, landscape elements, that sort of thing. They can also be contributing or not contributing. And so there's two technical reasons, and that's why I put this first, kind of the technical reasons, why it's important to come up with this understanding of what are the contributing resources. And that's because first, the Historic District Commission is going to view a contributing or not contributing resource differently, right? If something's a contributing building, the basic idea in a historic district is that's what you need to preserve and keep looking how it did in the historic period. Whereas if something's a non-contributing building, it's maybe less of a priority, or you might look at it a little differently. The second technical reason is it's the contributing buildings that are eligible for that state credit that Ellen mentioned, right? Since it's a competitive credit, it wouldn't really be fair if somebody who had a non-historic building were to be able to get that credit. So it's very important for the city to have a list of what the historic buildings actually are. There's actually a form that the city employee signs off on when you get that credit saying, yes, this is a contributed building. So for those legal and regulatory reasons, it's important to have an up-to-date understanding of what those contributing resources are. So that's why I put that as the number one goal. So the second bullet point up there, and this is very closely related, it's the idea of a period of significance, right? So that's the question of when we talk about something being historic, what era or what time period are we actually talking about? So we're actually, as part of this process, based on the significance and history of the area we're looking at, going to come up with a cutoff date and say, okay, this date, something more recent than that date is not going to be historic. Okay, so I just explained the technical reasons for this project. Now let me get into what are, in a lot of ways, probably the more interesting part of our work. So the more interesting part of our work, in my opinion, will be, and going on to the third bullet point, the narrative part, the actual written history of this district. And yes, there have been plenty of books and articles written, especially in an old and well-researched community like Ypsilanti, that talk about the history of the community. So we're not going to redo that. We don't need another one of those. But not much has been written that directly connects that history to the physical places around the neighborhoods like this survey report will. So that's important because when we say historic, we don't just mean something is old, we mean it's old and it's important within a particular context. So the narrative portion of this report will explain what that history is, and it's generally divided into themes. And then we will have, again, Ellen already mentioned this, and I'll show you some samples in a bit, but as Ellen already mentioned, for each property, we actually have a one-pager on that particular property that gives a picture of what it looks like now and a really quick history of how it's evolved over time. And finally, going on to the final bullet point, our work might be making some recommendations about boundaries. And I want to stress these would be very minor changes, such as if there's an area where there's a building that's been demolished, we might draw the boundaries so that area where there used to be a building is no longer part of the district, but that would be minor. And also that's just recommendations. That's a city council and city administration process that would happen in the future. We just looking at history and making recommendations. So now if you could go through the slides a little bit more, Tom, I'm just going to show a few photos that kind of illustrate the topics that we're going to be looking into. And these should all be really familiar buildings to us. So this is the Terry Bakery, of course. This is an example of one of the many, in fact, there used to be a whole lot more. I went to school here 15 years ago and there were a whole lot more at the time. False front, modern architecture, commercial buildings that used to be all over the place in Ypsilanti, especially on Michigan. A lot of them have been removed in recent years. So in that 1972 report that Ellen mentioned, these sorts of buildings were continued to be non-contributing, non-historic. So nowadays, I mean, do we want to look back and reevaluate these and think, okay, maybe this is a historic resource that is worthy of some protection, especially in the context of Michigan statewide. There aren't a lot of these left, and Ypsilanti actually has a pretty good number, so that might mean something, right? And even looking at this building, the sign in that building was very carefully restored about 10 years ago. So that shows that a property owner cares and values and thinks it's an important resource. So can I get the next slide? So here's just another example. Building on Hamilton. This is the other way around. This building used to be considered historic. And now if you look at the way it's evolved over the years, we might no longer consider it to be a contributing building based on the fact that most of its historic detail has been removed. Next one. So this one I'm particularly fond of. This is the Tridge. Remember, I mentioned it's not just buildings that we were looking at, it's bridges and structures and things like that. So the 1970s and 1980s documentation really focused on houses and commercial buildings. And part of our work is going to be broadening that look to look at other types of structures, bridges, parks, garages, that sort of thing. So this one, will we consider it to be historic? Probably not. It isn't particularly old. It was built in 1981. But then again, we might decide it's a pretty special bridge. Maybe we do consider it to be historic. There aren't a lot of tridges around. So we might, make that recommendation. And that's where the narrative history and context comes in. We'll look at how this bridge relates to everything else, both around Ypsilanti and elsewhere in Michigan and so on. So can I get the next one? So this bridge is one we would probably consider to be a contributing resource. I say probably because it's old. It's from 1912. But again, it's all about that context. How does it fit into the evolution of the rest of the city? And also this one's been altered. There's some not so historic elements that have been added. So I'm saying probably. And again, I'm picking these examples on purpose. They're not the easy examples. There's the ones where the answer isn't so obvious and some additional research and thought and evaluation is going to be needed. So can I get the next one? We have Riverside Park. And this is almost certainly going to be a contributing resource. This is a very important design landscape from the 1930s. So, not necessarily buildings, but there's going to be some historic features in there. Next one, please. So, okay, period of significance is another thing we're going to be looking at. Here's an example of that period of significance issue. This happened very recently. So property owners, as well as the Historic District Commission and the state tax credit people who administrate that, have to make decisions about properties such as these. Decisions like, okay, is this blue metal stuff on the outside an important historic feature? or would it be better if we remove the blue metal stuff and brought the building back to its 19th century appearance, which is what looks like what's going on in that photo. So this work is in progress, and we have to ask some of those questions. Next one. So this one shows side by side of how we would actually be updating the form. So on the left, you have a 1970s, there's a date on it, 1981 survey form that was done in Ypsilanti. And what we do nowadays, basically the same thing. The one on the right is not from Ypsilanti because we haven't done the work yet. It's for another project we're working on in Niles, but it just shows a picture of the house and maybe a little bit more detail than was done in 1981 about the history of the house, its materials, and so on, and how it's changed over time. So I have one more picture to show. Sometimes the reason we need to update these forms is just because the building's changed over time. Here's an example of a building, the Thompson Block buildings, that have actually, in a sense, become more historic now than they used to be, in the sense that they were pretty carefully restored to a historic appearance. So we have to update information to reflect those sorts of changes too. So I have one more slide to show. That's our scope of work, basically the timeline. It's kind of self-explanatory, just the steps we go through the process as we continue to work on this. So the community engagement meeting is what we're doing right now. We've already begun the overall research in terms of library, writing the narrative portion, that sort of thing. And of course, property owners can help with the research. We don't need overall information about the city. We can look that up. But if you have particular information about your neighborhood, your building, whatever it is that you want to share, that's great. That's actually hugely valuable. You can get in touch with us through Ellen, through a business card or phone call or so on. And the field work, this is actually a really important part of the work that we're doing and the work that the community needs to be aware of, because in completing these identification forms, that actually means we need to go out and look at each building. So at some point, we'll be standing on the sidewalk in front of the building, taking a picture and scribbling some notes. So it's important to understand that that's going to be happening, so you don't wonder why we're there. We're probably going to look at a schedule of like Michigan Avenue and Depot Town this summer. And then the residential areas more like October, November, taking a break when it's really cold, and then March and April. And that's really just having to do with weather conditions and lighting conditions that are best for photography. So that's probably going to be our schedule. We might have to modify it, if things change. And then once we have all that information, we get into the evaluation stage, which is when our team, the city, and the State Historic Preservation Office start to talk about, okay, what are the contributing buildings? What is the period of significance? That sort of thing. And then we write it all up in a final report and we present it at another meeting. So that's the timeline. And I got it, unless you think I missed anything, Ellen. Okay. Thank you. We're going to do a question answer in a minute.
I just wanted to draw attention to, I'm going to leave my information up here for a moment for all of you, and then all of you at home as well. That is my direct line. You can reach me there. And that is my email. So if questions occur to you, or if you say, oh, I have a really cool old picture of my house, I want to share it. Those are great ways to reach us here at the city. So now I think we should go ahead and open it up for questions. Tom, would you mind manning this part? Sure. If you want to stop sharing. Questions and answers, and I'll sit up here. Did you have a question, sir? Okay, yes. So the question was, when will the final report be released? So all of the data collection has to happen by the end of August of 2025. And the report all has to be written by then as well. So by September of 2025, we should have the data in hand, and then we can, as a city, start to go through it and see what we can do with it. Yes. The survey report itself doesn't have to, the question was, does the city council have to approve the report that results from this project? The city council doesn't have to approve the survey report, but when we go forward and we update our local study committee report, that will be very much a local process, and the city council will indeed have to, they would appoint a new study committee, and that study committee would take all this information into account and maybe their own information and figure out how they want to revise or the existing study committee report. And then, yes, you're absolutely right. There would be a whole process around that. There would be public hearings, and then ultimately city council would approve a new study committee report once we get there. But again, that is probably at least 2 years from now. Yes.
Does that suggest that the historic district might be eliminated?
The question was, does that process or does that suggest that the historic district might be eliminated? No, I see no possibility that the historic district would be eliminated. It is true that when you open up that process, that does become a question. But in Ypsilanti, I think historic preservation and preservation planning has been so ingrained in what the city, how the city works and plans, and what it values. I don't see any possibility that the historic district would go away. What's the question in the chat, Tom?
Says regarding the topic of.
Can you grab a mic?
Yeah. Question in the chat, Alex, regarding the topic of making boundary recommendations, though not a property immediately adjacent to the current historic district, will the Peninsular Paper Company sign at the Peninsular Dam be considered?
So what we are resurveying in this project is the local historic district as it stands today. We are not venturing out beyond the current boundaries of the historic district as it is right now. That project or that building, the powerhouse is, we are doing research on that. We are definitely, as the city works with its various partners as we remove the dam, we are definitely keeping our eye on that property. And I actually, as part of my work, another hat that I wear is researching that property and working on understanding its historic significance as well. So that's something that I'm doing on my own and with our partners. And certainly we will bring that into the more city planning processes as time goes on. But right now I'm sort of like Tim and Michael are doing the background research right now on our historic district. I'm also doing background research on that building and trying to understand its historic significance and its historic context. So, and then what we do with that information is, as a city, that will be another next step. But the scope of this project does not include the powerhouse right now. But please do know that it is something that we have our eye on, that we are absolutely thinking about and absolutely planning for. It's just not part of the scope of this project.
There's one more question in the chat. It might be relative to the last one, but I'm going to say it. Is there going to be any consideration given to historic EMU buildings and other normal park buildings? Understand that they are not in the current historic districts, but they could be argued that these are architecturally significant buildings in adjacent areas that may need to be at least acknowledged. That's from Hannah.
Yes. And that is absolutely, I should tell all of you that I get questions about new potential historic districts here in Ypsilanti. I wouldn't say weekly, but I would say monthly. I get someone says, well, I think this area is historic and we should be protecting it. And Ypsilanti is in such a great position that we have such a wealth of historic resources to protect and preserve. So I agree that I think in the future, so I started this job in 2022, and one of my very first, this resurvey was a goal of our city's master plan update from 2021. Getting this resurvey done was a goal that the city established and said, we want to do this. So that was why that one is my first priority. And the way that this data will feed how we administer our district going forward. It was really important to me to get this resurvey done. I absolutely agree that in the future, I think once we've completed this resurvey of our district as it exists right now, that I think of our future plans then will be to look at some of these other areas that are currently not in the historic district and think about and plan for their preservation as well. I absolutely agree that that is something in the future that I think will get attention as we move forward. Once we get this project behind us and do what we need to do with this project, I could definitely see us doing a survey of some of our other areas as well.
That's all we have so far in the chat. If anyone else.
Yes. Mhm. So correct me if I'm wrong, what I'm understanding you to ask is if the house is currently outside the existing boundaries. Oh. Okay. So you're asking if in this, as part of this resurvey, if a house was considering non-contributing before, but but would be considered contributing now. So the survey itself, what the survey does is it makes recommendations. That's what it does throughout. So even their list of contributing versus non-contributing buildings is strictly a recommendation. Nothing happens until we take all that information and we bring it to within our local processes and integrate it into what we're doing. So if that historic district study committee would get appointed and we would integrate some of these recommendations, there would be a whole public process. So this is not something, their list does not make it so. Do you know what I'm saying? So nothing will change going forward. But as we integrate some of their recommendations, there would be public processes, there would be public hearings. So there would be a whole local process around it. So I don't want you to think that this is now going to be imposed. It's not. Does that help? Okay. Okay. Yes. Yes.
If a building is in the historic, within the boundaries of the historic district,
Mhm.
it still is covered by the historic district regulations, is it?
Yes. So the question is, even non-contributing buildings within the historic district, those are also reviewed. And yes, they are. So even as it stands now, buildings within the local historic district boundaries do work on the exterior of them. And when I say work, it means work that will change the appearance of the outside of the building. The Historic District Commission does nothing with the interior. But when work will be done that will change the appearance of an exterior of a building within the historic district, yes, whether it contributes or does not contribute, it still goes through the review process. And so what the commission is doing in that case, just like new construction, we actually have reviewed new construction as well. So even though the new construction is not considered historic, of course, it still gets reviewed because of its potential effect on the district itself. So, so at that point, what the commission is looking at is sort of mass, how big the building is going to look, how big it's going to get next to its neighbors. Does its setbacks still kind of comply with still follow the pattern of its neighbors? So it's not looking so much the review when it's a non-contributing resource. The review is a little different. It's not so much saying these are the historic features and we need to preserve them. It's instead saying, okay, this work that's being proposed, how will it affect its neighbors and how will it affect the district? It's sort of a different lens when you're reviewing non-contributing and contributing. So yes, but all buildings within the historic district do go through the review process when work will be done.
There's a few more questions in the chat. I think you answered the first one, but I'm just going to repeat it anyways. Will you be coming inside the historic buildings for resurveying?
No.
Okay. And the next question.
I answered that one a little more detail. I actually meant to talk about this and I just forgot to mention it. All the work we do is done from the sidewalk or the street. We can't like step on your lawn or anything like that. So it's just us looking from the publicly viewable areas.
Mm-hmm.
Cool. Thank you. Another comment is just, what should we expect to see around Ypsilanti while the resurvey is underway? will there be surveyors walking around, interruptions or anything like that? And to business owners that people might notice. So
Again, I should probably answer this. There will be two people walking around. It's the two of us you see in the room. We're careful not to interrupt anybody. If there's something going on, we'll just come back later.
thank you. That's all.
Any other questions in the room? Yes. So the question is, are there any grants or other monies available to do preservation work on your historic building other than the state tax credits? For residential property owners, the financial incentive is that state income tax credit. And it is, you can get up to 25% of your project cost in qualified rehab expenses. And the webinar that we have posted on the Historic District Commission page will, or the Historic District page, I'm sorry, it will describe what's qualified and what isn't. But up to 25% of your rehab costs can come back to you in the form of a state income tax credit that you can use against your state income tax liability. So it's like a dollar for dollar credit that you can use toward your state tax credit, toward your state tax income tax liability, and you can carry it forward up to 10 years. So that's for residential property owners. For commercial property owners, there is that tax credit, that same tax credit as well. And then you might be, we also have a national register district. And if you're a contributing resource and you're a commercial property and you're within the national register district, which just has slightly different boundaries. And again, I'm happy to answer any questions you may have. You may find as a commercial property owner that the federal income tax credit works better for you. I think though that you will find that the state income tax credit is easier to use. And again, the state income tax credit is the incentive for homeowners. If you rent property in Ypsilanti, I know this is a thing, it is considered a commercial. It's considered a commercial property. So unless you are a homeowner who lives in the property, it will be a commercial project. If you are a homeowner that lives in the property, it's considered a residential. There really are not other grants available to property owners to do work on their properties, unfortunately.
Is that approved?
How is the state income tax credit approved? Yes. So you work with the State Historic Preservation Office. There is an architect there, Mara, who administers the program. And we have, when you go to the Historic District website, when you go to cityofypsilanti.com and maybe you just search up Historic District, but it is also where this link was posted. There is there is a link there directly to the state income tax credit program. And there is also a webinar that Mara gave here in the city and we recorded it as well. So you can get the link to it. But it's administered through the State Historic Preservation Office. It's a 3-part application process. You basically say, these are the historic features I have. This is what I want to do with them. And then when you're done, you send them back pictures saying, this is what I did. And there is a cap, but I don't believe we're near the cap yet. I'm sorry, you had a question. Yes, sir. So the question was, to qualify to use that state historic tax credit program, how old does the house have to be, right? So the program is for properties that are considered contributing in the district. And a general rule of thumb, when we look at whether or not something is historic or not, we're looking at ballpark 50 years, but there's more to it than that. It's whether or not it's reached an age, like whether 50 years, like I said, is just a rule of thumb. And then is it also, as Tim mentioned earlier, is it also significant? Does it is it an important, does it help tell the story of the district? Is there enough historic detail left on the building to help tell the story of the district? So there are a couple other pieces of it, and maybe Tim wants to add to that, but there are a couple pieces of it to determine whether or not a house or building, I should say, contributes. And if it does, then it is eligible for the program. There are properties that sometimes achieve significance, or, that would be considered contributing, even not, they're not even 50 years old yet. They just have exceptional significance for some reason or other. And so sometimes buildings they reach significance before they hit 50 years, but as a general rule of thumb, at least 50 years.
The only thing I would add is that almost all the buildings in the historic district are contributing one way or another. It
Mhm.
would have to be either like a particularly, it would be an obvious new building, or a building that's been very heavily disturbed to not be contributing.
Mhm. Yes. Mhm. Sure. So the question was, before this resurvey happens, could you still apply for these state tax credits? Absolutely. We have a few active applications open right now. Homeowners have used it. I don't have as many commercial property owners using it right now, but we do have some homeowners who are using the program. They're in the process of they're at their stage 2, or maybe they've closed out. We have one who's closed out their stage 3. So yes, you can absolutely apply for the program right now. And what I will say too is we actually do have a process in place for if a building would be considered non-contributing, because like in the case of the building that Tim showed on Michigan Avenue, where it had that blue, what I call a slip cover, but the blue metal cover on it. In that case, the building was considered non-contributing, but once he pulled that off, and as he goes forward, he's going to work with the State Historic Preservation Office to get that building back to contributing status. So as he restores the features, based on the documentation that we have, and we do have some cool old photos of it, that building will go from non-contributing to contributing. So it can go either way. Sometimes buildings fall out and they have lost their integrity over time, and they may become considered non-contributing, but it can also flip the other way, where a building that was considered non-contributing in 1980 would now be considered contributing, because the skin has come off and the historic features are going to be restored. Does that answer that? Okay. Yes. Well, that's a good question. So the question is, would there ever be a case where a feature like a cheese grater, like a mid-century cheese grater false facade that was applied to the building in the 50s or 60s, could that ever be considered contributing now? Could that ever be considered historic or significant? And the answer would be yes. If there is something, I think it'll be interesting to see what you guys come up with Terry Bakery, because I think in the case of Terry Bakery building, I think the argument could be made that it is historically significant, and that feature, and as we get the more research in about periods of significance, and the stories that the district is telling, and how does this building contribute to the telling of that story? I think there are cases where that could be considered contributing. There is an example of in Howell, they have an opera house. And it was like let's say 1880, 1890, I think it was probably about an 1890 opera house. And it had 1920s and 30s at the storefront level additions that changed, just like we have here. We have those porcelain enamel or panels that get applied to buildings like on our tap room or at Ziggy's. So some of those changes took place in the 20s and 30s. And then as we look at them now, we say, oh, that actually has achieved significance. Those actually have now become characteristics of the building. So when the Howell Opera House had to make a decision about whether to go back to the 1890 at the storefront level or keep what they had, they ended up keeping their 1920s, 1930s change. So the thing about historic preservation is it doesn't just stay in one spot. Time moves forward. And so we have to take those new understandings and that new appreciation and incorporate it. And I mean, there may become a day where a 1980s house will be the preservationists in the future will be looking at a 1980s house and trying to make that decision. Is it historic? It's hard for us to, I think, to wrap our heads around, but because time is always moving forward, that's a thing. Did you want to add anything to that, Tim?
No, I think that's great.
There's one more question that came up. Is the final report format going to be similar to the current existing one?
There are going to be new pieces to it that will be added. In the survey report, there will be like threats identified. There will be a summary, and there will be I don't know, Tim, if you want to talk about, I know let me see what I took a note about this. The new survey report, it's going to have an executive summary, a summary of places that the surveyors think further research is warranted. It'll have planning recommendations. It'll identify preservation issues and threats. It'll have survey maps, a description of the survey area, a historical overview and context, like Tim talked about, identifying those historic themes and writing up that narrative. It'll include the bibliography, and then that list of surveyed properties, again, that contributing, and then it'll also include the inventory form for each surveyed property, similar to what Tim showed, and then the photos from the field. So all of that will be part of the survey report itself, but it will be made available to libraries. We will post it online. So it will probably look different and include a little bit of different, maybe more comprehensive information than the survey report has now. But we'll make it as broadly available as we can, and really try to, as I said, in the coming years, really try to incorporate these recommendations into our planning processes as we go forward.
Only thing I would add is that's a perfect summary. I'm glad you had that in front of you. The only thing I would add is that format is actually specified by the state. So any survey report done in Michigan is going to have the same basic format. By page count, the bulk of it is going to be those forms for each building. And then probably the second largest part of it is going to be just the narrative history of the community.
Anything else?
That's all I got.
Anything else out there in the room? One thing that I'm really excited about this process is making those connections to historic, the connections that maybe were overlooked before, or that have now come to light over the years as we think about history and the different lenses that we want to look through history now. I think that's going to be really really important to see those connections that we'll be making as we take another look at our historic district. I think that'll be really interesting to see what Tim and Michael come up with. So is there anything you want to add, Michael or Tim?
I don't think so. One thing I just was kind of thinking of is when we were mentioning some of the cheese grater buildings and the porcelain enamel and so on, there's a really strong and meaningful history and a connection between Willow Run and Ypsilanti from the 40s and the 50s. And that whole story kind of lends strength to the argument that some of these newer modern features are important and significant.
Mhm.
So we'll be looking into all of it.
Yeah, that's true. Yes. It's a good question. The question was, does Ypsi Township also have like a historical program and a historic district? I don't think so. I think they really are working. There's a really active group that works on Willow Run and telling that story and preserving that building. But I don't, correct me if you guys know differently, but I don't think Ypsilanti Township has a historic district ordinance.
Well, first a question is Ypsilanti Township incorporated or unincorporated? If it's unincorporated, there's a Washtenaw County Historic District Commission that could create historic districts in Ypsilanti Township.
Mhm.
But I'm pretty sure there's none currently.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a good question though, because you're right, there's a ton of history over there that's a story that's absolutely worth telling. And it impacted us too, right? So there's that connection as more housing was needed for that factory. There's just a ton of connections between us. You're absolutely right.
There's just one more statement that kind of contributes to the, end of this presentation. It's just how and when will we be contacted to contribute and research our findings?
If the person asking that means they have information they want to contribute to us, then get in touch with Ellen, please. You know, that history of your house or the old photos, or whatever. And that's a good way to get that information sort of
Mhm.
in an archive for posterity. If you mean you want us to contact you, then I don't see why we wouldn't have some opportunity for a member of the public to review a draft report and make comments before it becomes final. So I'll leave that up to Ellen, though.
Mhm. Yep, if you want to, what I had here in the physical room was a sign-up sheet with where I was collecting emails, so that you could receive project updates. But if that's something that you want to do, if you want to receive project updates, do absolutely feel free to contact me at my email or my phone number, and let me know that that's something that you're interested in. If you want to see, like Tim said, if you want to see where the research is going, or you want to see summaries of where we are, status updates, I'm very happy to share that with you. Tom, do you have a sense if that answered their question?
Yeah, I think that's great. I'll put Ellen's contact in the chat as well for everyone still attending.
Anything else? Any last minute thoughts? Good. All right. Is there any last minute thoughts online, Tom?
No.
All right. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you all so much for attending online, for watching this at your convenience when you can. And thanks so much to the folks here in the room. We really, really appreciate your interest in the project, and we're really looking forward to moving forward. I think this is a really exciting project, and we're happy to be doing it, and we're excited. So thanks so much, everybody. Really appreciate it. Thank you. And we'll talk to y'all soon. Thank you.